Welcome back. In this video, we'll be inserting some data into our database using SQLAlchemy. The first thing I want to do is open up the models. I'm going to go to the source model. And I'm going to add a class method to this model. If you're not familiar with class methods in Python, they're methods that belong to the class structure itself rather than to an instance of that class. So you would never call this method on an instance, like say a particular source. You would never call this method. You call this method on the class itself. And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But this decorator tells Python that this is a class method and not an instance method. This class method is going to be called insert from feed. And the first parameter is this little class object. It's CLS because, class is a reserved keyword in Python. And this is similar to self in instance objects, or in instance methods, but in this case the class is the self property because this is a method of the class rather than the instance. It all sounds confusing, but it'll make sense, I promise. So we take this class object and this feed source, and in this case our parsed feed here, we have this little helper function that gets the source from the parsed feed, and that's what we're going to want to pass into this feed source parameter. And then this helper class method is going to do the dirty work of actually inserting this data into the database and returning a source object that we can use, a SQLAlchemy instance of this source. So the first thing I want to do is just grab some attributes from that feed source. We already know what it returns: link, title, subtitle. So I'm going to grab exactly those. Feed source, link, title, and the subtitle. And now I can instantiate this source model using these variables as keywords into the constructor. So we set the link, set the title, and we set the subtitle. So now we've got this object which is a constructed source using these values. And we can tell the database session to add that object. And this will actually do the insert in SQL. But it's in a transaction, it's in this session. So you'll also want to commit the session. And then we'll just return from there. Actually, we'll return the source from there, so that the code using this class method now has access to the source that was just created. So I guess at this point, maybe I can just do a quick test. So let's go to the terminal. And I'm going to start up Python 3 and then just import some things from our app, like the app object itself. I should probably write that in the right order. Sorry, it's hard to talk and code at the same time. From app, import app. From models, we'll import the source. There's just a little warning. Anyway, then we can import that feed module. So now what I want to do is use the feed module to parse a feed. So that's easy, we've already done that before. We just say parsed is feed.parse. The feed I'll use in this example, I'll go back to that NASA breaking news feed because I think that's a neat one. So now we've got this parsed feed, and it's the whole feed. So we can get the two portions of it using those two methods that we have. In fact, dir our feed module has get articles and get source, and parse, of course. So the first thing we want to do, we're interested in that source. So I'm going to make a new variable called feed source, and it's going to be the result of calling this get source helper on that parsed feed. So now we've got this feed source object, and it has the data that we want. It's got our link, our subtitle, and our title, which is exactly what we used in that constructor to create a new source object in our database. So what we should be able to do is say with app.appContext, because we need to be in the context of our app. Like I mentioned in one of the previous videos, the Flask object does a lot of setup behind our application that if we were to just use these methods directly, that setup wouldn't exist and they wouldn't have the context that they need to do what they need to do. So all of our actions with the database need to be inside of our app context from Flask, and this little context manager using the with keyword will do exactly that. So we'll call that. Now inside it, we've got our source module. That's bigger than I thought it would be. Okay, right. We imported source from our models module. So we've got the source, and we know that that source class, our SQLAlchemy model, was defined in that package. So we've got that, and we just created this method called insert from feed, which is a class method. So we're calling it on this class object. There's no instantiation here. We're just calling it from the class. I guess I should maybe return this object, because this class method returns the newly created source as a SQLAlchemy object, and it might be interesting to have access to that. So then we can say, oh, we just pass it that feed source that we created. That should work. I'm going to have it print the ID from this object and then hit enter to execute all of this. Column feed cannot be null. Well, we did something wrong. Go back to the code and try to figure out what happened. Okay, so source has this other attribute called feed, and yeah, feed isn't nullable. I forgot to extract that here. I mean, I guess another way to handle this would be nope. Easiest way to do this is probably to just require that the feed URL be included with this insert from feed method, and then to add that as a keyword to this constructor here. So the feed URL has to be passed in with this insert from feed. There are other ways we could do it. Like I was thinking I could include it here, then you'd need to include the URL there, or I could include it in this parsed, or this parse method to attach the URL to the parsed feed. I'm not going to do any tampering with this for now, so I'm just going to have it required here. That's not too bad. Okay, back to our terminal. I have to redo all of this. I should be able to go through this pretty quickly though. Exit, launch Python 3 from app, import app, from models, import source. Good. Import the feed again. Parsed equals feed.parse. Already has the quote there. Cool. Now we've got our parsed. We need our feed source variable, which we get from calling feed.getSource on the parsed. Oh, I'm gonna go ahead and say feed URL is also that variable. How did I mess that? Oh, I need to assign it. That equals sign. Okay. So now we've got the feed source and we've got the feed URL. Now we can open up that context, the app context. And now we can say this variable s equals source dot source, and this class method insert from feed. Then we pass the feed URL and the feed source. Okay, now we'll see if we can print the ID from the created source. And it did print an integer. That seems promising. So let's go ahead and exit out of this little command line Python terminal and go into our MySQL database. Login is root, our password is password because we're real secure like that. I'll use that feed reader database that we're inserting everything into. So go into there. You know, we show tables. We should have just inserted something into source. So let's just say select everything from source. And there we go. We have our ID is 1, our title is NASA Breaking News, our subtitle is RSS newsfeed containing the latest NASA news articles and press releases. Our link to the feed source is this nasa.gov URL, which is correct, and then our feed URL is this RSS URL. And then we have this date added, which is today and the time. So it worked. We just inserted our feed using the little helper method that we created, that little class method. So that's pretty cool. Now we have to do the same for the articles. This is going to be a little bit more complex because the articles, right, are this list of articles, and then there's an added gotcha to that, which is that we don't want to insert two articles from the same source with the same GUID, like their global identifier. We have that uniqueness constraint, but we need to insert them in a way that that constraint doesn't throw an error or something in our database. So let's go back to the code. Let's go to article here. Very similar to what we just did, we're going to create a class method. Use that decorator to specify that it is a class method. And insert from feed is going to be our class method name. It takes in that class object just like before. Now this one we're going to need access to the source ID. It has to know what source the article came from. So we're going to pass in the source ID whenever we call this class method. And then pass in feed articles, which is that list of articles that we get from calling get articles from the feed module. Cool. So the first thing we need to do is construct a statement that SQLite is going to use to insert all of these articles into the database. And I'll call this variable statement. It's going to take our article object, the model, and we're going to grab the underlying table attribute of it. And this table attribute has an insert method that will actually generate the insert command for this model. So that's pretty cool. And then even cooler is that we can prefix this insert command with ignore. And what this is going to do is it's going to create an insert ignore statement in SQL. So when this uniqueness constraint fails, when it tries to insert something with the same source ID and GUID, meaning it tries to reinsert the article, it's just going to ignore it. And that's cool because we're going to be parsing this feed at a regular interval, and frequently the same article is going to be in there, right? Like if there hasn't been an update since the last time we parsed, it's going to have all of those articles. So it's going to see them all again, and we don't want to duplicate them in the database every single time we check to see if there's a new feed. And that's exactly what this is going to prevent. So now we can say articles, we'll create a little list here, and for each article in this feed articles list, which was passed in, we want to fill out some of these attributes in a dictionary. So we're going to append to this articles list a dictionary, and that dictionary is going to contain a title. It'll get that from article, which is returned from here. So now we've got title, summary, published, link, and ID, which is the GUID, not the primary key ID from the database. So title, I'll put in first. Body, we called summary in this method. So do that mapping here. Now link was just link. So article link. That's all good. GUID is the ID of that article. We won't do anything for unread because it has the default to true. So the only thing next to do is this source ID, which we passed to this method. That's that variable right there. Oh, we do have this date published, so say date published comes from our article, and we name that just published. So, wrong file. Okay, just published. And now we need to actually insert these. So the database engine object has an execute method that'll take this statement and this list of articles, and it'll do a batch, like a bulk insert of all of these articles using this insert command. So that's all good. In theory, we should be able to test this just like we did before. So let's go back to our terminal. We'll go to Python 3, exactly like I did before. I'm not going to explain everything because I can type faster if I don't. This time we're importing article instead of source. And then import feed, parse. So this time I'm getting the articles instead of the source. That should make sense. Just make sure that it is what we think it is in there, right? Everything looks good. So now we'll grab that app context again. So we're in there and we've got this article module that has our article class in it. So article.article, and now what we're dealing with is this insert from feed method, which takes in this source ID, right? We don't have the source ID on hand here, but I just checked it in the database and I know that it's 1, so I can use 1 as the source ID in this case. And then we should be able to just give it our feed articles, that list, and this one doesn't return anything, but hopefully it doesn't fail when I execute this, so fingers crossed. Didn't fail. So we may have just inserted a bunch of articles from NASA's breaking news. Let's exit from Python, go back into MySQL as root, password, use that feed reader database, and select everything from the article table. And I have to type the SQL correctly. Oh no, it does look like it inserted it correctly. I saw a bunch of blank spaces, but it's the formatting for the table that MySQL uses. So if everything is what it looks like, it starts with the ID, title, body, link. So yeah, the first article has an ID of 1, title, the body, yeah, and then the link. So now we've got these methods that will help us insert this data into our database. In the next video, we'll be writing some routes for the Flask module. So we'll add some endpoints to our web application and actually start making this accessible from the browser so we can post new links for feeds and have it start scraping this stuff automatically for us. So bye.